Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Zal, and just a handful of days ago, Blizzard has made a fairly sizable announcement regarding Mythic Plus content and them trying to curb some of the toxicity within dungeons by banning players. But it's a move that actually a lot of players are behind, as it'll hopefully curb some of the toxicity within the pugging Mythic Plus experience, with them looking to take action against players that leave Mythic Plus dungeons early. Mythic Plus dungeons is one of the most popular forms of PvE content, since they're so easy to get into. You don't need as many players as you would for a raid, and you could dive into these dungeons at various difficulties. There's plenty of opportunity for gearing and pushing progression and tackling some of the more difficult content the game has available, and they're also a ton of fun. But the pugging experience of M+ can definitely be improved when it comes to War Within expansion, especially as we head from Season 1 into Season 2. So today I want to talk about what Blizzard is doing when it comes to these bans and why they're going after players when it comes to leaving dungeons, but also other ways that they can improve the pugging experience of the Mythic Plus content to make it better going forward. As always, if you guys enjoyed this type of updates for War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right into this discussion. You know, I'm actually surprised to see with them announcing that they're actually banning people with an M+ content, like for leavers in particular, because it feels like it's a topic that's been brought up since, I think, even Legion, right? When the Mythic Plus dungeons originally launched. Players have always complained about somebody potentially leaving their key and bricking it. And I guess this is true at the higher end levels whenever you are getting like to really high end keys where a single mistake can mean the key is over. But especially this is a problem in some of the lower keys with people leaving when the key is perfectly timeable. Even if you had a wipe or two, there's still plenty of time for you to be able to finish it. It is the worst thing when somebody just gets cold feet and for some reason thinks the key is no longer timeable and bails on it when it totally was. It's just an abysmal experience, especially for pug players, especially for players at lower level keys. Maybe this is the first time getting into a key, and that is enough to ruin someone's experience with M+ system in general. I actually think that banning players, especially for some of those entry-level players, this should create hopefully a more healthy experience where players are punished for leaving a key and instead, I feel like also should be in some ways promoted to finish the key and at least encouraged to finish the key all the way through. But I think this ban thing is essentially going to affect a lot of the lower keys much more than higher keys, and should hopefully improve the practice key environment that a lot of players really need, because nothing worse than, let's say, you're starting up a +4 City of Threads as a brand new tank to the game, picking up the role for the very first time, and then there's a bumpkin in your group who's got Incarnation rolling, and then he gets upset at you for only pulling 3 mobs at a time. Like, I have a couple of friends that are stepping back into War Within expansion and stepping back into the Season 1 M+ environment, and we have other players within a +4 key that expected them to do a pull that you would see in a +12 and higher. So it's just an unrealistic expectation for a player that's here to literally learn what these dungeons do to begin with. Of course, them being a bumpkin player with all of the cooldowns rolling against 3 mobs, they instantly leave that dungeon as soon as things don't go their way. So that type of an absolute abysmal experience that a lot of new players have to suffer through hopefully will be reduced by quite a bit. And still, very surprised that they're actually banning people, or at least saying that they're going to be banning people going forward. But like I said, I have a few friends that are coming back to the game, and they have an experience of a player who's just getting into the keys for the very first time. And I've also been talking to a couple of friends that are really big into pushing some of the higher end keys, and we've all been talking about how they could potentially improve that early player experience to get more players, to get that fresh blood into the Mythic Plus pool of rotations within Mythic Plus dungeons. And I think there's easily some things they could do to make dungeons a little bit less punishing, especially in any keys that are +10 and lower, specifically under +10 dungeons, because they're kind of like practice keys anyways. Anywhere from +2 to a +9, those are the practice keys to eventually get you into doing +10s, to get your achievements, to get your portals, to get some of the best gear from the Great Vault. This is something what everybody is striving for, or potentially to push past +10s into 11s and 12s and get into the pushing key environment, which should be honestly encouraged in the future. And one of the best ways to do it is to try to make some of those lower keys a little bit less punishing. Like, one of the main currencies you'll get from M+ is going to be the crest currency, which is a must-have. However, you don't earn a lot of these crests for not timing a key. You earn 12 for completing a key, and for like your ults in particular, that's at least enough to upgrade a piece of gear, because in most cases it just requires you 10 Rune Harbinger crests or the Gilded crest, depending on how geared your main is, in order to be able to upgrade some of those pieces and items. So at least earning 12, even if it's not enough for like your main to upgrade an item, for your ults it's at least something to work with, and it gets you that better progression. But if you don't time a key and then turns into 5 Rune crests or whatever type of crest you're trying to earn. And that I think creates a pretty sour experience when you're spending 40 to maybe an hour, maybe longer time in a key just to earn 5 measly crests. It just doesn't feel that good. So I wonder if they could pull back on that punishment mechanic, especially for some of the lower keys, and just allow players to be able to earn full amount of keys for finishing a dungeon. So if you time it, you get more score. But if you just finish it all the way through, you at least get all of your crests. So then even if you spend a lot of time in that dungeon and everything went haywire, at least you're still rewarded for your effort and the time spent within that key. And that could be a very, very easy upgrade they could implement in order to improve the keying experience. Also, the M+ key downgrade mechanic every time you fail a key is also one of those sour points where when your own key downgrades, it's not that fun if somebody else is the reason why the key is bricked, especially if somebody, let's say, leaves the key early. So maybe they could change the way the key downgrade system works, because like I said, it feels like anything that's under a +10 is almost like a practice key anyway. And maybe they could adjust this downgrade mechanic where it doesn't downgrade for keys under a +10. It allows players that are in that learning environment to be encouraged to push forward, to push their key to a higher level, but then they could still enable that downgrade mechanic for any keys that are above a 10 when you're in that push environment. Make it like an extra mechanic of, you know, an additional layer of punishment, so that if you do not time a key, if you don't play super well, yeah, downgradation is fine. I feel like in that environment it's perfectly acceptable, but for some of the starter players, I just don't think it's a great mechanic to encourage them to push the keys. A lot of players want to see themselves progress forwards, not backwards, and I think that's another mechanic that could help a lot of the newer players and some of the starter players for M+ be a little more encouraged within this kind of environment. Also, mechanically, I think we can all agree, specifically in this season, keys can be a bit of a brain overload, especially compared to, let's say, Season 3 of Dragonflight, which had the highest participation and key completion rate of any season. But this time around, I feel like a lot of the dungeons have a lot of little things going on. A lot of little casts that need to be interrupted, a lot of enemies that don't even cast spells but still need to be interrupted in one way or another, whether it's stuns, knockups, knockdowns, disorients, or any kind of little micro disruptions that a group needs to have and be filled with in order to be able to have an easier time dealing with some of those trash packs and enemy mobs. And I feel like in certain dungeons, like take Necrotic Wake for example, some of the ranged non-caster enemies that you can't interrupt but they'll still continue to range you, that won't walk towards you if you interrupt them or anything like that, those mobs can really be tricky, because not only do they hit like a truck at some of the higher, more deadly key levels, but which can be pretty bad for the game, but also when you have 2 of these mobs focused down a single DPS at once, you may just be in a situation where you either need to predict that they're targeting you and press the defensive to survive, otherwise they will just one-shot you, and that just feels pretty terrible. And it would be nice if there was some kind of like a way to bypass it, to counter it, without just having to focus to see who they're targeting and then have a defensive ready. Like if those enemies maybe were more likely to attack the tank, who has all the armor, all the defenses to deal with that damage taken, compared to the rest of the party that doesn't have the defenses for it. So maybe they could adjust some of the way the dungeons work going forward. I think it'll be the best way of going about it. And one of the better dungeons that I had a great experience with, I would say, is probably the Dawnbreaker. Not necessarily the flying aspects of it, because clipping through the boat is still a problem, but when it comes to the actual enemies within that dungeon, I think it's a fantastic key for pugs. In a lot of the different trash pulls there's a lot of opportunity for DPS to just focus on DPSing and not having to juggle mobs nearly as much with different knockups and blinds, although those things can be helpful in some situations. But all of the important mechanics of that dungeon are either interruptible or are dodgeable, or there are clear places where defensives are needed, like when you're taking on down the different lieutenants of the dungeon itself. You have a very specific damage over time mechanic that will put up on a target, and that is how you know you need to pop a defensive or give that target an external. And all of those things I think are very, very clear cut, and they're really easy to track in a pug environment, where As a DPS, you can kind of just let your brain mellow and focus on damage. You don't necessarily have to be focusing on constantly interrupting every single enemy in a trash pack. And I think more dungeons like these probably need to come out in the future, or potentially they could adjust the current pool of dungeons we have right now in order to allow players to have a bit more of this focused role mechanic where as a DPS, you're there to do damage and not have to micromanage all mobs constantly. Also, with Season 1 of War Within, this is the first time we've seen a big change to our affixes in general, which has been a fairly sizable chunk of the difference in terms of how you experience dungeons compared to, let's say, Dragonflight Season 3 that we mentioned earlier, which was an absolutely a popular Goliath of a season. But for the most part, I'm actually kind of sorta okay for the most part with the changes to the affixes in the War Within. I'm perfectly happy with the thematic affixes of Xal'atath, and I think it beats having to have Sanguine and Skittering and Bowstring and all those other older affixes we used to have in other instances, because it allows you a little bit of variety, especially in lower keys, plus also a fairly sizable combat benefit as well. And these affixes are pretty much invisible, and you don't have to deal with them mechanically at some of the higher push keys. Instead, dungeons become a lot more threatening, all the enemies inside of those dungeons become a lot more powerful, and you get to focus on the dungeon mechanics specifically over having to battle the affixes and the dungeon as well. Tyrannical and Fortified are both, I think, are also fine, and having them both combined at plus 10 and above, I thought would feel awful, but it actually feels kind of alright in terms of upscaling that difficulty. Though there is still a weird jump between difficulty 11, plus 11, and plus 12 specifically. However, I do think the affix for the timer, it is quite punishing, especially at higher levels. And I think to some degree that affix specifically also leads to some of the players being more likely to leave dungeons because of this punishment for the timer. I'm not even sure exactly why the timer also needs to exist at some of the really lower keys, because like I said, I think any key that's below a plus 10, it's almost like a practice key that sets you up for the actual real keys at plus 10 and higher, because this is where you get the most amount of rewards from the game, either in terms of gear or plus 10, or Mythic Plus score at any level higher than that. So I think when it comes to the timer, I actually think maybe certain keystone levels don't necessarily need a timer. Like plus 2s, plus 3s, maybe even plus 4s, because those are really truly the environments where players are there to learn these dungeons. What we noticed so far with players getting to max level is a lot of players are going to skip Mythic Zeros as well as Heroic Dungeons and are probably not going to be learning some of the mechanics from those difficulties for these instances. Mostly because the loot from those dungeons is just not that competitive, even for a player that's just hitting max level really early, because you could dive into Delves, get a bunch of champion track gear, and then you need to go to upgrade that champion track gear. So a lot of players will just skip Mythic Zeros and Heroics and just jump into like a plus 3 or a plus 4 for some of the Ruin Harbinger quests. And I feel like maybe at some of those lower levels, maybe that's where the timer isn't really necessary, because that is the true environment where a lot of players will be learning the mechanics for these dungeons, the different enemies, the different pulls. And I feel like maybe for those players that are in that kind of environment, maybe the timer isn't specifically necessary, because it can, one, add extra pressure, so all of a sudden now you're doing this dungeon with extra pressure, that can affect your performance, but also that timer can also limit the amount of opportunity for you to actually learn these dungeons and learn what they do. Plus, the expectations from every other player within the dungeon is the tank is going to try to see if he can beat the timer and go as quickly as possible. So not only are players unable to really slow down and figure out everything in the dungeon, but also are forced to hurry up and finish it as quickly as possible, and it just creates a cascading effect that just doesn't benefit anybody really, leading to a lot of players actually bowing out a Mythic Plus system completely, just sticking to Delves, but really unable to progress further because they lose all interest from Mythic Plus. But that is where a lot of the crests and a lot of the currencies they can get in order to upgrade their gear really is, leading players to really hitting a wall when it comes to their own personal progression. So I think little affix adjustments could be made in order to inspire players to continue pushing forward as well. But to bring this discussion back towards the bans that we talked about earlier, I do wonder how this whole Mythic Plus bans will affect some of the higher up keystones that you're pugging, like anything that's above a plus 12 difficulty, like 13s and even 14s and maybe even 15s, because when it comes to some of the higher keystone difficulties, one bad wipe can actually mean the key is bricked. There's absolutely no way for you to recover, because the amount of time that is needed for that key requires, in some cases, very few mistakes to be made, and a full team wipe in some of those cases can mean that there's just not enough time for you to complete a key, even if you played perfectly from this point forth. Because of the affixes in Mythic Plus, it makes deaths super punishing for the timer, and you can sometimes fall far enough behind where there's just absolutely no opportunity for you to finish out the key whatsoever. And when you're doing keys at plus 12 and above difficulty, there's no necessarily real reward that you would get from finishing those higher end keys. I mean, you get score, but the score doesn't affect how much gear you can get or your currency. It's more just a personal rating and potentially a possibility for you to, if you get really high score, to get the title for the season. But if you, let's say, are not necessarily in that title range and you're trying to finish a 13 or a 14 and you can't time it, there really isn't a lot of reasons why a player would stick around in that key. And I'm not saying that from like an angle of, oh, it's just like there's no reason for them in a toxic manner, but just realistically, there's just not a lot of reason for them to be in that key. The key is basically dead. The key is basically bricked. So it's very uncommon for that kind of higher difficulty environment for players to leave the key, because by that point, everybody in that dungeon is aware that, yeah, no matter what we do, the key is basically over. It is bricked, GG, go again. So I wonder how those bans are going to affect those players too, because they said in a general state that they're going to be monitoring players that are leaving keys early for one reason or another. So I'm really hoping that if they are going through the bans, it doesn't necessarily affect the higher end difficulty keystones. But all in all, I'm actually kind of excited about this ban system for the keys. At least I'm hoping it'll improve in any case the lower keystone experience. I would love to see some other additional improvements to reward players for sticking through the key to the very end. I feel like taking action to punish people that leave, but also rewarding players that stay is probably the best approach with this type of an environment, in order to encourage more players to stick around to the end of the key and finish it out, because at least there's some sort of reward for you, especially when you're doing some of the lower keys, which are, like I said, I view them mostly as just practice keys. It's just an opportunity for players to practice the dungeons, gear up, grow stronger until they can finally reach those plus 10 difficulty keys to get the best of the best gear from within your great vault. But as always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and hope you guys did enjoy this discussion video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community for regular War Within and future patch updates. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.